John Henrik Clarke is a hero to many in several black communities, an intellectual hero. Professor Clarke headed the African and Puerto Rican Studies Department at Hunter College. He has lectured widely on the black condition and experience in the United States, the Caribbean, and Africa. He lives quietly in Harlem in a brownstone house in which he has a collection of over 20,000 books on just about every dimension of black people's experience imaginable. Like It has spent the better part of a day with Professor Clarke recently. This edition will share the fruits of that visit with you in just a moment.
Well, I was born in Union Springs, Alabama, a farm town.
What year?
1915.
1915.
And I grew up in a mill town called Columbus, Georgia, near Fort Benning, the big army post.
Tell me about your folks, your parents and your family.
Well, my parents were sharecroppers. That's a term a lot of people have lost the meaning of. But a sharecropper is a landless peasant. They farm other people's land and get a share of the crop. Generally, the landowner keeps the books, and they nearly always get cheated. And he manipulates the books in such a way that at the end of the year, you always have to work another year to pay off the debt from the previous year. Finally, nature interceded in our case, and during a storm, the wind blew the roof off of our house and wrecked our farm. And my farmer picked up his brew and moved to Columbus, Georgia, with the hope of earning enough money to come back to Union Springs and buy land and be an independent farmer. It was the dream of his life. It was a dream he never realized.
What happened?
Well, he worked in mills, he worked in brickyards, he worked himself literally to death. And thanks to a 10 cents a week policy, he was buried in free land. The length of his body from head to feet, 6 feet under the ground. The grave we buried him in was the only free land he ever knew.
What kind of a man was your father?
He was a semi-illiterate man with great hopes and dreams for his children. And he worked toward those hopes and dreams. His greatest hope for me was that I would eventually be the owner of a corner grocery store after I had rejected the idea of being a farmer. Then when I told him I wanted to come to New York, I wanted to come someplace, I wanted to leave the South, and I wanted to be a writer. He never understood what it meant to be a writer. It was a strange thing to him. Because among his children, I learned to read early. I learned to read for a rather selfish reason. I wanted to teach the junior class in the local Baptist church, Gethsemane Baptist Church. I wanted to teach Sunday school. So I learned to read not from books, but from signboards and throwaway ads.
You taught yourself?
Yes. I was teaching myself from the beginning, mostly from things that were discarded. And when I grew up, I was working in the homes of rich white people or semi-rich white people and delivering clothes because my mother was a washerwoman. My natural mother before she passed. And
how old were you when she passed?
Oh, I must have been about 8. She passed in 22 or 3.
Oh.
Must have been about 8. I was already learning to read. And
Well, what about school? Didn't you go to school?
I went to school intermittently and didn't go to school on a regular basis until after she passed. We were sent back to Union Springs, Alabama, where I lived with my great-grandmother and my grand-aunt on a farm. His father, my grandfather Jonah, my great-grandmother Mary, and he would visit sometime. And there was time I saw 3 generations of our family in one room at the same time.
They're all from Alabama?
Alabama, except that my grandmother Mary said that she came from a farm in Georgia originally. And every time we would meet, she would tell the story of her husband, Buck. She had 3 children by Buck. And Buck was sold to a slave breeding farm in Virginia. This is something we don't talk about. Slave breeding farms.
What's that?
These were farms that they bred slaves like they bred horses, because he was handsome and tall, and they just like they take a thoroughbred horse to breed another thoroughbred. They took human beings to breed other human beings. So he was sold to a slave breeding farm in Virginia.
Do you know where in Virginia this was?
Well, she didn't know either. So after emancipation, she spent 3 years in Virginia looking for him. And she never found him. And every time the family gathered, she would tell that same story as though we had never heard it before. And then she would turn to my grandfather Jonah, and she would say the same thing over again. Jonah, that was your father. That was my grandfather, my father's father she was talking to. This is what I mean, is that very often I would see when my father visited the farm after my mother died, I would see 3 generations sometime coming together. My father and his people, my grandfather and his people, and my great-grandmother, Mary. And she would tell us the story, because my great-grandmother Mary, that we call Ma Mary, she witnessed the last slaves who came over directly from Africa.
Did she ever tell that story?
She told very often.
What did she say about that?
These stories of those slaves.
What did she have to say? What did she see?
And she told these slaves who, she said, spoke in grunts instead of languages. She could not understand their language. They had not adjusted to the English language.